Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, PPIC, for letting us keep the title "The California Weather Gods Must Be Crazy," because they were this last year. So part of the craziness that we're going to talk about today is, of course, floods, and the idea is the idea of this conference this year is managing both wet years and dry years, but focusing principally on how we manage the wet, both for reduction in flood damages as well as water supply. And we've put together a great panel today to talk about this. The most self-effacing member of the panel is Jane Dolan here, who's many of you know. She's the head of the Flood Board, Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and executive director of the Sacramento River Conservation Area Forum, and also you're an 8-term supervisor in Butte County. Is that, if I got that right? Which is really quite remarkable, especially for a Democrat in that part of the world.
And a girl.
And a girl at that. And we also have Nahal Ipakchi here, who should be familiar to many of you. She works at Kearns West, where she specializes in the design and facilitation of inclusive public engagement. We're going to hear from Nahal about how to include low-income communities in flood planning in particular. We have our go-to regular visitor, Allie Forsythe. She's been on the stage on several occasions, and Allie is known well to you all because she's basically head of environmental planning and permitting for sites. So why do we have her here? I do want to explain in advance that she should be in the next panel where we talk about storage, but because we have a member of the State Water Resources Control Board on the panel, there's this ex parte communication problem that we run into. So we've asked Allie to come here, and she gets to back clean up on this panel as a handoff to the next panel. And then we have Tessa Beach, who I think this is the first time you've appeared with us, and Tessa's with the Army Corps of Engineers, the San Francisco district, and she's the chief of planning and environmental services there, and very knowledgeable about flood control and sea level rise and all those good things we're going to talk about. So I'm going to start with Jane, who's like, please don't start with me. Yeah, okay, that's a good reason to start with you. So Jane is the head of the Flood Board, and so this is a big deal position. I would like to remind those of you who have a long memory, I was fired from that board with enthusiasm by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I think his phrase to me was, "You won't be back." So Jane, we wrote a little blog early in the year that said wet years, they are a test. They perform a test of the system. You don't have to change that. It should be on. Hopefully it's on. You just have to talk into it. There you go. And so I want to give you the opportunity. There we go. It's working. I want to give you the opportunity from your position as the head of the Flood Board, and actually have been decades involved in flood management issues, particularly in the northern Sacramento Valley, to give us your perspective on how things went, what worked, and maybe what didn't work. And again, this is a system-wide view of the Central Valley flood protection program. So go ahead, Jane.
Well, I'll speak a little bit about the system here at the end as well. First, I just want to say the Flood Board is not the entity that rolls out all of the efforts to prepare or to respond when there are these disasters. That is our partner. We are a partner with DWR. So what did occur and was good is that DWR, no matter whether everyone thinks it's going to be a drought again, they gear up for there to be a flood system. So they're talking with all the local entities that you need to remind people, you need to be sure that you identify your evacuation sites if they're needed, and they store and place equipment and supplies that are necessary everywhere. As we all kind of remember, in October, November, December, as you prepare for the flood season, everyone thought, well, there's not going to be one. It was the legislature, the governor's budget, everyone was gearing up for another cycle of a disastrous flood. And then, oh boy, did the rain come. The result, and we had reports at the Flood Board, and I've probably read every press release that was possible and did a little traveling when it was safe to do, was very disparate. And I will say for the valley where I grew up and where I lived, it was better. The Sacramento Valley was more prepared. The Sacramento Valley's system was more integrated with each other. Sacramento Valley started to contain the floodwaters in the early part of the 20th century, and then realized they could not. So we have systems of bypasses and systems of the levees. We all know that the farmers made, and a considerable number of reclamation districts, and then levee districts came on. But with the devastating floods that seemed to occur every 10 years, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, 80s was a really bad one. And that's when the local governments decided it's time for us to step up. We can't wait for the damages, get everybody out, and then repair and put it back to the old system. And partnerships began to develop, which was very, very important. We now call them regional flood planning, but they're partnerships. In my county, the Sacramento River is our Butte County's border, so we sort of said, well, maybe we need to talk to Glenn County. And then on the south, it's Sutter County. Maybe we need to talk to Sutter County, see how we could do that. And they were not comfortable conversations. Counties tend to think they know everything and don't need to talk to others. Counties can tend to have tense relationships with their cities, but we worked it out and created a way to have flood management and the things that needed to be improved from 1910 levees to get them into the 20th century for protecting. So that those things are very important, and they came into effect with this. Very different in the San Joaquin Lower Valley. And historically, the way that it developed, the way it dealt with floodwaters, land ownership, and frankly, the politics there is very, very different and challenging. We certainly have disadvantaged communities in the Northern California, absolutely do. They tend to be more in the fire areas, but we do have them in the valley as well. But the number of those in the San Joaquin Valley is far more than other places. And these are unincorporated communities, primarily those who are working on the farms. There are a few that have cities and mayors, but they tend to, they're scattered geographically. So it was a lot more complex and complicated there. We know what needs to be done. In the Flood Control Acts in the mid first decade of this century, the legislature, for the first time in California's history, said there will be a plan. Other than that, it was reclamation districts, cities, landowners, counties trying to figure out what to do, but it wasn't coordinated unless folks took it upon themselves to begin to talk and do regional. So the first ever plan was enacted in 2012. There is a plan. We know what to do. The state spent an awful lot of money analyzing everything, creating maps and information from the structure to the validity, an entity system that would be protecting people from the danger of floodwaters, and really identified the things that need to be done. And the need is great. But what has been done is also great, but there's never an ending there. You can't entirely protect people from floods, but you can do the best you can to assure that you do not have life loss and you do not destroy really important infrastructure or people's homes or communities. But the San Joaquin Valley, there's some burgeoning hope there that people are beginning to talk with each other. There are very large landowners, we all know that, who think they're going to take care of their land, and that's fine, and that's what they will do. So it's beginning, but it's not a situation where the flood board, we do have jurisdiction, even though the plan stops at Stockton. The flood board has jurisdiction for the whole valley, but we can't come in and say, we know what you need to do, so now do it. That never works. We've got to figure out where the voices are to build them up locally, and it's beginning. It's beginning.
So Jan, I want your unvarnished view on what happened in the Tulare Basin this year and what the big takeaways are from the reemergence of ancestral Tulare Lake. And is there even a possibility the flood board could be involved in that? Now, I remember years ago being told the only people they hate more than each other is the government down there. So it's a pretty tough place to work. But so I want your view on what happened in the Tulare Basin and whether there could be something better there.
Well, I recognize it's a very challenging place. Yeah. And now that you told me when you got robust, the governor got rid of you, so I'm going to try to be calm about this.
It's harder to fire you.
We'll see. I'm a native of Butte County. I was born in Oroville and grew up in Chico. So tough politics. And I served on the Board of Supervisors, where they just kept saying, we don't really want you here. Then I stayed 32 years. So I do know that you can resolve these things. You need to listen, you need to communicate, you need to bring resources. So for the San Joaquin, I think it will take some time. And how the really large landowners can be brought forward, and this is what is necessary, that they are part of the valley and they're responsible for doing things that work with cities, local communities, with counties and the state to develop a plan that protects people's lives and important property. I've read all of the New York Times and LA Times stories where they say, these large ranches took care of themselves and that they did until they were actually forced. Well, until DWR and the Office of Emergency Response just came in and said, we're going to move levees to protect Corcoran and Allensworth, and we're going to try to protect these communities, and you take down your levee. You can't protect your tomatoes while people's lives are in danger. So it was very challenging. And one thing that we've learned, because when the legislature said there will be a plan, every single legislator, assembly or state senate said, do not include our valley. So it was not. That is something that needs to be addressed. How that gets addressed, to find the voice down legislatively in the San Joaquin area that they think it's important, will probably not happen right away. But there are some plans in place to begin to say what needs to be done with this valley.
Okay, so let me ask you one last thorny question. And we all think of SGMA as being the sword of Damocles, right? If you all don't get your groundwater sustainability plans together, the government's going to step in and take over. That's not a new model. In the 2007 SB 5, there was the requirement that all urban areas had to have 200-year level of flood protection by 2025. And your report right there pretty much shows that's not going to happen. They're going to come up short. What happens when they come up short? And I think I know what the legislation said, but I want to hear it from the head of the flood board. What happens if these communities cannot meet that standard?
The standard is for all communities that are 25,000 in population or greater, or their general plan says that they plan to do that. And my communities up in my area that have maybe 5,000 people all plan to be big, because all you folks who can't afford land in Sacramento are going to come to Calusa. So they expect that, but they haven't quite built for it yet. It will be very problematic. There has been immense efforts to meet that standard. Yuba County has met the standard. Marysville will come close if the Corps of Engineers is able to continue the funding by Congress to finish the levee work that's there. Stockton has made great effort, but in a very challenging area. The way flood system improvements come about is you need to know what you want to do. So that planning is not something that's done in a year. It's years long. Then you need to get permits, which is it's also very time consuming. And I sit on a permitting board, and it's clear we need to do a better job and basically a faster job. But to match their local contribution, which is required, they need to assess the property owners. So they've done elections. The voters in California created a constitutional measure that anything other than something that's public safety, and maybe flood systems need to be put in that along with sewer systems, water systems. You have to have an election, and you have to have over 50%. So they were making it in the 40s, but not there. But they had one recently, and it occurred, so they can move on. So funding is a real issue. Effort within the plan area is clearly ongoing. I think when that kicks in and the deadline is you must do it, a city council or a board of supervisors or a recognized government like a levee district or a reclamation board needs to make a finding that they've achieved it. And they need to send that to, I guess, DWR, I guess the flood board. It doesn't say where to send it. It just says you need to make the finding that you've achieved it. So there'll be a lot of conversation about whether you have or not. And if you haven't, the law says you cannot approve another building permit. So I'm guessing there will be a broad community that will suggest that their might be some change to that definition.
It's
Some of the talk that I hear, not officially, but just folks that say, what do you think that can be done? And then they tell me, I think they should say, if you're making substantial effort, you're going to be all right.
So expect the legislature to step in.
It's the one law that has consequences, so
Yeah.
it probably will change the consequences.
Okay, well, I thought it was pretty novel at the time, back in 2007. Tessa, let's jump to you. So, going with the weather gods must be crazy at this point. You are the Corps. I mean, you are the nation's flood planners, and have been for more than a century at that. And you're good at that, but you're facing a unique challenge in this regard. And one is to how to deal with the extreme risk of today, under today's standards, while also thinking about tomorrow and these changes, this increasing volatility. And I know the Corps has been making a lot of progress in the last few years on that. In fact, but it's going to be opaque to most people. So kind of catch us up on what the Corps is doing on trying to deal with this hydrologic non-stationarity, we used to call it, for a big word, and how they're dealing with that, grappling with that, particularly in the planning right now.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. So for over a decade now, the Corps has really been working diligently to incorporate future impacts of climate change into all aspects of our civil works portfolio, really, in terms of planning, design, and operation. And this really helps us develop and implement solutions that are robust to some of the extremes that we heard about in the opening presentation, for example. So let's imagine a flood risk management planning process. Essentially, the Corps has regulations that require us to do what's called an inland climate hydrology analysis. We look at important variables like stream flow, precipitation, temperature across a vast range of future climate scenarios, I think on the order of 30 or so general climate models. And out of that, we get ideas about the directionality and the potential magnitude of those variables in the future. This allows us to plan our infrastructure alternatives in a way that's going to really be robust to that entire range of potential future scenarios. And so it helps us deliver solutions to communities that are resilient in that non-stationarity that you're describing. This is the same in coastal flood risk management as well. Essentially, when we're working on the coast, we're required to evaluate our alternatives and formulate our alternatives in a way that addresses a range of future sea level change conditions. So for each local area that we're developing a project in, we will look across a low, intermediate, and high sea level change scenario and evaluate how different project alternatives would perform against that, with the intent of developing solutions that are both robust and adaptable under a variety of future scenarios. So that's planning. We also are implementing operationally new ways of conducting our infrastructure so that it is incorporating climate change effects that we're already seeing. And one of those Ellen touched on as well in the opening presentation is forecast-informed reservoir operations. So in my district of the Corps, that's been implemented for the past 4 or 5 years at Lake Mendocino and Coyote Valley Dam. Essentially, this is a water management strategy that allows water control managers to take information from watershed monitoring and weather forecasting and make more real-time decisions about whether to release or retain water from our reservoirs. A great example, in 2020, we retained about 11,000 acre-feet of water that would have otherwise been released, and added that to water conservation and water supply because our water managers were able to see that there was a dry forecast and felt that it was safe to retain that additional water in the flood control pool. Conversely, we could use the same management strategy to address flood risk with that infrastructure. So if we can forecast that there's a very wet period coming, like we experienced previously, we can work with our water supply partners and say, hey, we maybe need to release an additional amount of water from our reservoir in order to create additional flood control capacity for the forecasted wet weather that's coming towards us. And lastly, in operations in our coastal regions, just in the Water Resources Development Act of 2022, we saw a new direction to the Corps to start increasing the potential size and length of jetties or breakwaters that we operate in order to address sea level change. So we're still waiting on implementation guidance for how that process is going to play out, but that's another direction we're going, where we're looking at modifying and operating infrastructure in a different way.
So I have a couple of really quick questions for you. First, what do you say to Jane Dolan, who has a 200-year level of flood protection standard, which was basically declared back in 2007, and what you're telling us, or we all know, is this is a moving target. How do you deal with that? I mean, if you've said somebody puts in billions of dollars to get to that standard, but it's changing, how do you guys at the Corps deal with that? Or do you not worry about that? That's the National Flood Insurance Program that deals with that.
Well, there's a couple processes we can implement to deal with that. So when we create infrastructure, we can always go back and reevaluate, go into a general reevaluation of the performance of that infrastructure with a non-federal partner that's willing to cost share in the evaluation and planning to modify that infrastructure. There's also the ability for non-federal entities to modify infrastructure on their own through an approval process that the Corps will provide approval for if they deem that to be safe and consistent with the use of that infrastructure. And then finally, I would say, this is less about existing infrastructure, but in our planning process, we always have had the option for entities to put forth what's called a locally preferred plan that provides a higher level of protection than the Corps might otherwise be able to federally justify. Now, that does require that the local entity pay for that additional increment of protection at their own cost, but it still includes the full federal, contribution for whatever the federal government can justify. So it would just be that added increment.
And it's useful to remind everybody here, you work for Congress.
That's
and
true.
You've got this money for planning, but you don't have the money to actually build all this stuff.
That's correct. Congress always has to both authorize a project for construction, and even once they authorize it, they then separately have to actually appropriate funding for us to go into design and construction.
And today the president is going to announce $6 billion available for basically climate, both mitigation and adaptation. And I think, Jane, your short-term estimate was you need $3.5 billion over the next 5 years. So there's the challenge, is how to fund all this stuff. But I have a last question for you before we go to Nahal. The Corps has been criticized heavily over the years for using this sort of benefit-cost ratio to decide what projects do and do not get built. And what it does is it tends to be really rough on rural communities, low-income communities, which are often communities of color here in California, and throughout the West, for that matter, or actually throughout the United States. But that's changing, and in a good way, it's changing. I'd like you to give us a sort of a short summary of how that's changing before we hand off to Nahal to talk about the details of those communities.
Yeah, sure. I think the key thing I really want to hit home here is that the fundamental authorities and regulations through which the Corps is implementing its missions are actually not changing. In my opinion, what we're really seeing is a more holistic use of benefit categories that have always existed in our principles and guidelines to inform decisions about how we expend finite funding resources. And, much like the state, the federal government at all levels has placed additional emphasis through overarching initiatives like Justice 40 on really delivering benefits to historically underserved or low-income communities. And so as part of implementing that in the Corps, the Assistant Secretary for the Army for Civil Works, who sets policy for the Corps broadly, has really emphasized two things in terms of the Corps' delivery and planning of Justice 40. One is removing barriers to participation, and the other is increasing access to the benefits of our civil works programs for such communities. And it's that second one, I think, where we really want to focus here. And a key component of that is what we call our comprehensive benefits in decision documents policy. It's a big mouthful. Basically, what
it's the core, after all.
Yeah, it's the core. I'm trying not to throw out acronyms left and right, basically. It says that planning study teams, for all the alternatives that they formulate, have to evaluate and identify for decision makers benefits equally across economic, social, and environmental categories. And in doing so, what it really does is put those benefit categories on equal footing, when historically what we've seen is maybe one category, such as economic benefits and costs, has really taken a front seat, and other benefit categories have taken more of a back seat. And so it's putting those on equal footing. Study teams can now, and are required to now, identify for decision makers the plan across the alternatives that they formulate that maximizes total benefits across those categories. So the categories have always existed, and now we're just pointing out the plan that maximizes the total benefits, and we can actually recommend that plan. We have to seek a waiver to do so, but at the district level where planning happens, our goal is to really start leveraging this policy to recommend those types of plans to our decision makers for approval.
But if there's going to be federal money, Congress has to agree, and that's
right.
Let's not talk about Congress. All right, so let's talk about you, Nahal. You're in the trenches in all of this, and something that we at PPIC and many others have struggled with for years is how to reach out to these communities, these low-income communities, which tend to not be involved very much. And this is your specialty, and I want to hear how you are advising people and directing people to basically engage with these communities and bring them into the process.
Thank you. Is this not on? It's not on. Oh, yes, it is. There it goes. Okay, great. Thank you. I wanted to share just a quick disclaimer, just in case, that what I share is not intended to be a personal attack or affront on anyone in the room. I'm just representing the voices that are not in the room today, and that's, some of it will come across as maybe harsh, but that's the reality of the situation. So I just want to start by responding by saying that adding new perspectives and developing new relationships with communities in the conversation with water management agencies and other water, practitioners who have a strong attachment to their role as experts and water leaders is a major barrier, actually. So to enter the conversation, it's not the most welcoming dynamic to invite the communities that have not been a part of the conversation for 100+ years to now, contribute their perspectives to how to invest and how to plan for these water issues. And I want to share that while I could list off numerous barriers to access and engagement that you've probably heard 100 times, examples like language access, the time and location of public meetings, childcare needs, compensation for time commitment, et cetera. These are all barriers that are relatively easy to address, and they can be often addressed through budget line items and through a work plan that explicitly calls out that those are needed. So I'm going to focus more on the barriers that are not easy to address through a budget per se. As mentioned by speakers before me, low-income communities are often located in areas that have suffered from lack of investment for decades. A lot of times it's unincorporated areas. I'll use Marin City as an example. Marin City is an unincorporated area in Marin County, and they have issues, and they don't have the relationships with their county government. They're building them thanks to the environmental justice leaders that have built their own capacity and understanding of all of these technical issues when it comes to flood resilience and climate resilience in general. And so, as we know, county governments do struggle to provide the services and support that these communities need. And especially when it comes to climate impacts, counties are not yet clear on where they fit into the governance structure, at least not from what I've seen so far. And another segment that I want to speak to is the farm worker communities. They're low-income communities that lack access to resources, information, and infrastructure to cope and recover from these large flooding events, such as we saw in Pajaro. And these communities, as we all know, are suffering from the failing infrastructure due to numerous issues, and I want to just point out that a lot of it has to do with their lack of understanding of how local decisions are made and how these projects are carried out. And again, the lack of the relationships that, they don't have those relationships with their local elected officials, decision makers, low tax base to fund infrastructure improvements. And I'm going to point out that while we don't like to admit this, they are not involved because of institutional and systemic racism that they've been subject to for decades. And the community leaders that I've supported over the years are justified in feeling that their needs are never prioritized. And so when they are approached by a public planning process or an entity, an agency that needs to implement a program that says that the funding will only be, will need to prioritize disadvantaged communities and will require community engagement with tribes and other underrepresented groups, these communities are hesitant to give their time of day. It's based on a longstanding lack of trust, and usually when I bring up the lack of trust as an issue, it's perceived to mean a lack of trust on the community side. But we should also acknowledge that the lack of trust is on the agency's side and the implementer sides. There's an implicit bias and just a lack of trust whether or not these communities will get it, whether or not they will be able to be fiscally responsible if they were to receive funding. And I can't tell you how many times that I've helped out public engagement campaigns where engineers, agencies, and other clients have requested that we withhold certain information from presentations so as not to worry the public and the community too much. They don't want, they don't have the time or the energy really to have that backlash of, what could come from the community learning about what happened over the past decades as far as the planning processes that took place historically that have led them to be in this situation. And I'll just point out that one example that we hear about more and more is the redlining example. And so if you point that out to a community that it was not aware that redlining was happening, that's our job to explain the history of why they're in this situation that they are now. And so I think that just, one takeaway from this example is that our timelines for our projects should include this understanding that communities need to, we need to work on the capacity building, we need to work on building relationships, and we need to make sure that the projects have enough time for all of this. And so the term, it would be moving at the speed of trust. And, that is what it is. It's slow down. I know that we're all in a hurry and we're frantically trying to figure out how to respond to climate impacts. But if we don't want to leave these communities behind any more than we already have, we really need to consider slowing down and developing some lasting, genuine relationships.
But I've had several conversations with you in which you showed there is success. So give us a success story. Well, give us a success story, because let's not all go away ready to slit our wrists because we can't do anything. Give us a success story.
Yes. Well, so
please.
Yes. Okay. So I mentioned the timeline. I think that I'll use an example that's relatively local because I'm based out of Berkeley. So for me, one of my clients is the Delta Stewardship Council, and I'm supporting them with outreach and education and public engagement to make sure that their adaptation plan has, the community behind it and understands it. And they started with interviews. They've developed an environmental justice expert advisory group that has weighed in on their process from the beginning. And they've also interviewed environmental justice leaders in the community to learn more about what their concerns are, and not just the concerns related to adaptation, but just what's keeping them up at night. Just even if it has nothing to do with this specific project that the Delta Stewardship Council is implementing, they have learned about it as a holistic. What is keeping them up at night? What is their family concerned about on a day-to-day basis? Because that's, again, our job, or it's the agency's job to be able to connect the dots with, what's relevant to the community and ensure that there's relevance there so that they would actually want to remain engaged in the planning process. And it included staff time for staff to go to community events as participants, volunteers. You can't make that direct connection to the outcomes of needing to write this adaptation plan, but it's just this holistic understanding of how to work with community. And so I've seen that, the staff have been invited to events by community-based organizations, going to community organizations meetings, asking to be put on standing meeting agendas to just introduce themselves, and not starting with an ask of, we need input on this plan, but this is who we are. This is why we care about, what's, keeping you up at night. And just trying to develop some genuine relationships. And I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's great. So this is actually a nice it may seem like an awkward handoff, but it's a good handoff to Allie, because the fact is we're going to talk shortly here about sites writ large. I'm going to ask you to give everybody an update on that before the cone of silence, while the cone of silence is here before the next panel. But start with the fact that this issue has come up even in sites, and I want to hear sort of a short summary of your perspective of the role of sites in flood management, community issues, particularly you've got some low income communities that are being affected. So give us that before we get to the big picture of summary of what's going on with sites.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, PPIC, for having sites and for accommodating this. I realize it's a little bit of a tricky setup, but we appreciate it greatly because we love to get out and talk about what we're doing. So at sites, we're looking to build a new reservoir in the Sacramento Valley. I think most folks have probably heard about it if you read Water News or any of our new listservs in the water world. But we are looking to build it in the middle of a disadvantaged community. Maxwell and Ladoga are two communities there in Colusa County. We've done a lot to outreach to the community and really build those trusting relationships to think about what are the community needs. For example, we have a bridge that goes over the reservoir specifically to make sure we continue to connect to these two communities east to west. School kids are bused 45 minutes from Ladoga to Maxwell, and we're building that bridge to make sure that those kids don't have to sit on a bus for an hour and 15 minutes each way was our other alternative. So thinking about those community needs. The other thing about sites that doesn't get that much attention, but I'm glad we're here to be able to talk about, is that we provide 100-year flood protection for some of our local disadvantaged communities in Colusa County. It's something that we, our environmental and our water supply benefits usually take center stage. But through building sites and through, as PPIC has highlighted in its November materials, we have the ability to do these multi-benefit projects. And we were awarded $50 million, conditionally awarded $50 million from the California Water Commission for flood control benefits. We will provide 100-year flood protection to about 10,000 acres in Colusa County, including the community of Maxwell, unincorporated community within Colusa County. Our office is actually in Maxwell. We had 3 feet of water in our office, in the Sites Project Authority's office in 2017. So these flood benefits are real and are, a real consideration for that community of Maxwell. We're excited to do that.
That's great. That's not a dimension we ever talk about with sites. So speaking of that, give us an update on sites before we go to our lightning round into the Q&A. So.
Sure. Quick updates on sites. So right now we are focused on 3 things at sites: affordability, constructability, and permittability. Those are kind of the 3 pillars of the stool that we see to get this project off the ground and into construction. So in terms of affordability, we pretty much have our funding lined up. I know that sounds a little crazy for 22 water districts to come together with different credit portfolios to be able to fund a $4.5 billion infrastructure project. But we're doing a tremendous amount of work with the U.S. EPA under the WIFIA loan. We were invited to apply for and actually have applied for a WIFIA loan from EPA. At $2.2 billion. If it's awarded, it will be the largest WIFIA loan ever awarded in the nation by about 4 times. So it kind of throws the charts way off if it's awarded. And we're doing a lot of work with US EPA to actually get that loan awarded. Part of that is creating benefits and obligations contracts. Our JPA is cities and counties and water districts in the Sac Valley. They cannot pay back $4 billion, $4.5 billion of infrastructure. So we're working with all of our members, which are public water agencies, 22 located throughout the state of California, that will pay for the project and receive those water supply benefits, to create contracts. Contracts of what we're providing to them and contracts of how they would provide those funds back. Really kind of backing that WIFIA loan to be able to show the US EPA that we have the support and we have the backing to repay these funds consistent with the terms of the loan. Between the WIFIA loan, California Water Commission funding, our federal funding under the WIN Act, along with the USDA loan that we have for rural communities, we are almost fully funded. So we're just putting all of these pieces together to close these loans and get all of this funding finally lined up. But we have our full funding portfolio together, and it's just closing on those loans. So that's exciting for us. In terms of constructability, we've been doing a tremendous amount of geotech work out in the field to figure out what the heck is underneath all of our dam sites, and how do we design these dams to make sure that they are safe and safe for faults. And as you know, we all know California is a pretty seismic rich region. So there's a lot of activity for geotech, borings, test pits, fault studies, all that kind of stuff going on out in the field. And we're looking to complete 30% design in spring of 2024, so just a couple months away. And then permittability. This is one that's very exciting to me because I'm supposed to be leading this, so so I feel a lot of personal accountability for this. But we just released our final EIR/EIS with Reclamation as our NEPA lead. So it came out earlier this month. And our board is actually considering the final EIR along with adoption of the project this Friday. This is a culmination. DWR first released the notice of prep for this document in 2001. This is a culmination of 20 years. We've been at it for 6, but truly this has been going on for 20 years, and we're about to bring it to closure on Friday, which is really exciting. And the neat thing about it in that document, you know, we talk a lot about sites being a 21st century infrastructure, and sometimes we think, well, what does that mean? You're building a new dam. You know, is that really 21st century? But we're off stream, and in that document, we're going to make 3 kind of key commitments to solidify that 21st century infrastructure. We're committing to be carbon neutral, to offset all of our greenhouse gas emissions for the life of the project, which I look at and say, that is phenomenal. If we are a project here to help us with climate change, we cannot be a gross emitter. That does not make any sense. So we are looking to be carbon neutral, and we'll have an extensive effort to minimize, avoid, and then offset our greenhouse gas emissions. We're committing to really protective diversion criteria for fisheries in the Sacramento River. Really functionally, we can only divert in high flows, in flood flow situations. And that commitment is in the document. And then the last piece totally lost my mind right there. Yeah, I can't remember what the last piece on the commitment was, so apologies for that. But there's a third piece in there in our commitment that is really something that I'm really proud of for us as an organization and how we're moving sites forward on that.
So, real quick question.
Yep.
CEQA, you got the green light from the governor.
Yep.
But if you read the statute, it says feasible. Is this feasible to do it in that short a period of time?
We believe it's feasible. And the work that we've done, both from an environmental standpoint, but also a construction standpoint, yes. And the governor just certified us under SB 149, the infrastructure bill. And that's exciting for us. We're the first project to be certified. A lot of folks, you read the media and it says like, oh, this is going to allow us to not have as much environmental stringency and environmental protections. If you read the legislation, I think it says something different. Requires that we guarantee to the governor, we make a binding commitment to the governor to address our impacts at disadvantaged communities, address our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a really exciting thing for us, and we're really thankful to the governor to certify us as an infrastructure project.
Okay, so that's all the stuff we couldn't say in the next panel. So that's why we moved it to this panel. We are running a little short on time, so I want to do a quick lightning round question for each of you, and you've got to give me a really, really short answer. And Allie, I'm going to start with you. What keeps you awake at night, and what basic policy change is needed to help you sleep better?
Yeah, what keeps me awake is I think about all the things that we can do with sites and trying to just get this thing permitted and built and then think about that future. So I have to hold my brain back a little bit to say, not yet. We need to get it in place first, and then we'll think about all of the amazing opportunities for it. The thing that I think about policy changes is ties into PPIC and storing water for the environment. We're really trying hard to store water for the environment, have a dedicated space in sites and be able to allow the state to use that for environmental needs as the state sees fit. And we're kind of running into a little bit of kind of regulatory challenge on that we're trying to navigate our way through.
Not surprising. As a doctor, I recommend a glass of red wine before you go to bed. So Nahal, what keeps you awake at night?
I'll just refer back to the stories that I'm hearing from communities like Marin City, and to know that one severe storm event can result in residents being trapped in a 4-foot deep bowl of water, backed up water with septic, with failing septic and backed up sewage, and also that they don't have an emergency escape route. This leads to public health crisis. It's much more beyond just a flood or just a storm issue. So the policies, I'm going to just echo what Ellen shared in the intro, is they need to reflect a more holistic understanding of what climate impacts will lead to these kind of domino effects. So climate smart policies and funding that is invested equitably.
2 glasses of red wine. Tessa. No, switch.
All right, what keeps me up at night is that in our race to address some of the extremes that we're facing, we will miss opportunities to really deliver some great multi-benefit solutions through engineering with nature and nature-based solutions. And I think the policies that we need to really be able to do that more seamlessly are changes in regulatory policy that essentially make it easier to permit those types of solutions.
A beer. I recommend an IPA for you. Okay, Jane, you get to finish real quickly because I'm being yelled at by my handlers.
What keeps me up is, even though I understand all of the barriers, all the regulations, all the requirements, is that the pace of enacting what we need to do and what we know we need to do is just too slow. And a policy change that I'm advocating is that the authorities and the work of the flood board needs to clearly partner more closely with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. What I have gleaned from every single Zoom and in-person presentation I've gone to, listening to the scientists, is that even though we're going to have extreme and erratic weather, we will have enough water to recharge the ground. We will have enough water for the future, but we don't manage it very well. And I live in an area where they all say, well, Jane, just dam it all up and not let it go to the ocean. That's a very interesting conversation.
No.
But we can do that if we can have widened floodplains that are the groundwater recharge. Widened floodplains are a storage, and that's what we need to work on.
Great. I recommend champagne.
Sierra Nevada.
Fair enough. So we talk too much, and that's because I'm involved, and that's what happens. But we want to host questions from the audience for a few more minutes. And if you have a question, raise your hand, and someone will rush up to you with a microphone. And if you don't have a question, we have some. And of course, those of you who are online, you saw the earlier email address, and we're getting stuff over here from our handlers at this table, and they will ask the questions for you. So if anybody has a question, raise a hand, and someone will rush up to you with a microphone. We were that thorough.
There's one over there.
Oh, there, way over in the corner here. Way over there. We can't see. We're blinded by the light, which I think is what Bruce Springsteen wrote. Right.
Hello. This question is for Tessa. The Corps has a project going on in a little pocket next to the Westin Hotel and the Scott Seafood. So two-part question, the purpose and the goal, if you can give a 1-minute synopsis. And then the second part, when will it be done?
It's not our district.
Yeah, I can't actually address that at all. I'm sorry. I'm from the San Francisco district, so I'm not familiar with that project in particular.
Jane will answer the question for you, since she's the head of the flood board.
It's a project with the Corps and the local entity, the Sacramento area flood control, and it's been going on from Folsom to that for years. It is reinforcing the levee so that it meets a 500-year standard for meeting climate change in the future. And 2027, I think, is the ending for that. It's been in segments for the last 10 years. These things are slow to go.
Okay, any other questions from folks? Well, so we're going to get a question from one of our, we're getting an online question. Oh, there we go. Jay Ziegler, you got to use microphone. This is the Delta Water Master, for those of who don't know who this is.
Thanks. I think Jeff kind of went up to the line of this, but I do want to compliment the Central Valley Flood Board in really administering a great process in terms of developing the Central Valley Flood Plan and involving disadvantaged communities, involving communities across the valley. I think beyond your concern about regulation, it seems like we have a ginormous funding gap to meet ahead of us to get essential work done quickly. And I just wonder what your strategy is to solve that gap.
Keep asking. Keep bringing information. And really respecting and bringing forward the voice of our regional flood management planning areas. They have defined what needs to be done in their area. We're just constantly talking about this need because the first priority is to save lives. And each time there has been devastating, we have lost, and we should not do that anymore. The next is incredibly important infrastructure. We've put our hospitals, our highways, and our critical infrastructure for people's lives, from education to you name it, at risk because we have not improved a 100-year-old system in parts of our area. So it's needed. We just have to keep advocating.
Actually, I encourage you all to take a look at the plan that they put out in 2022. It's actually really quite comprehensive. And yes, here's the prop. And I sat down and at least I read the executive summary and I looked at the cartoons, but the diagrams. But it's actually extraordinary how far we've come since that legislation in 2007 on flood planning, and it kind of could be a model for the rest of the state. But it doesn't. Well, I haven't heard a lot of uptake in places like the LA Basin on that style of it. Okay, other questions out here? Otherwise, we're going to go to the online questions and questions from staff right there.
Are there additional risks to storing water than flooding, including risks to indigenous species or habitats? Or? So
can you let me see if I understand it. Are other risks associated with storing water?
So there's water management, the option of storing water.
Yes.
What are the additional risks in addition to flooding, especially considering indigenous habitats and...
Tessa's going to take that.
Is this one on?
The answer is yes.
So when we talk about FURO in particular as a water management strategy, we're still talking about the same overall reservoir pool. We're never talking about going beyond what's the total capacity for our flood control space. And so therefore, we've sort of already have evaluated the effects to species and habitats in essentially constructing the reservoir itself. I think, these water storage or water management strategies, whether they're happening in real time or taking an extended period of time, have a similar level of effect because the water pool overall is not extending to like flood new areas of the reservoir. Does that answer your question? Even with the new reservoir, oh, that may be a question for sites.
Yeah, I can answer that from a site's perspective. There's a lot that goes into building a new reservoir, and it has impacts to species, absolutely. There's no question about that. And we've looked very carefully at those impacts in our environmental document and are getting prepared to both achieve permitting compliance for those, but also to mitigate those. So our team is kind of shifting now from getting the permit to implementing the permit and really thinking about how we mitigate our terrestrial impacts for sites in a way that adds value to the species. Potentially starts to look, even though we're not required to, but starts to look at how we can create mitigation to contribute to recovery of the species, of individual species, how we can implement mitigation in a way that contributes to our local communities and our disadvantaged communities, creating jobs, creating opportunities for tribal governments and organizations to have additional gathering places. So there are absolutely impacts of sites to the environment, and we're thinking those impacts will be fully mitigated under state law, but we're also thinking about how do we go a little bit further and create something better, and create something that we look back and say that was really cool. And really quick, Jeff, I remembered the third one, finally.
So you're qualified to be the governor of Texas now.
Yeah. The third thing that I'm really proud of in our environmental document is we're committing to probably the most comprehensive water quality monitoring effort in sites ever undertaken of a reservoir this size. As we understand water quality today, so much more than we did in the 40s and 50s when some of our other large reservoirs were constructed. We have an extensive water quality program, both to make sure that the water quality is what we expect, but also to just create a wonderful database and information to understand how these large reservoirs function.
Okay, I am getting the red card, and it's not for the fouls that I've committed, but it's the time that our time is up. So we're not going to be able to go to the online questions. And if there are online questions, I'll try and field them and make sure that they get answered for those who submitted them online. So with that, I want us all to thank our panelists very much for this.